evening for the 360 Solution Lecture Series. Tonight we have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Jillian Eklund. She is a graduate student from the University of York and will be presenting original research on the Victorian restoration of the chapter house at York Minster. She takes a novel approach to the architectural history of the field of historic conservation. Please join me in welcoming Jillian.
What you're seeing on the screen in front of you now is a quotation from the chapter acts, which are the daily meeting records of the governing body of the York Minster, where they decide that they are going to carry out some restoration in the chapter house, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. But the important thing to note here is that while they're talking about adding things like encaustic tiles and new hot water heating for the building, the character of the restoration is very much determined by the period in which it occurs, which is the mid-1840s. So this is York Minster. You can see this picture was taken from the city walls that surround the city of York. It's a medieval city and are well known for its medieval character. And you can see that the building dominates the skyline from wherever you are. It's one of the largest Gothic cathedrals that's left in Europe, and that means that it was built in the late medieval period, although there was religious structures on this site since Anglo-Saxon times. There has been an incredible amount of scholarship devoted to this building. People have given their entire lives to the study of just this one place, but the more we study it, the more there seems to be to know, especially because lately there's been a shift in the way that we look at the scholarship. Previous authors have done a lot of delineating who's done what when, and what I'm looking at is the lives of the people who have been involved in this building and what those buildings can tell us about the people that make them and use them. The story of the chapter house is the story of the men, and this is unfortunately exclusively a men's world, that devoted their lives to creating this building, and says a lot about the changing attitudes towards conservation over the last 200 years. What you're seeing here is an image from a book known as Contrasts, written by a man named Pugin, who was incredibly influential in the first part of the 19th century. And he looked around him and noticed that his world was drastically changing. In the top part in his publication, you can see the image of the medieval village, where everything is simple, everything is ordered. The only punctuations against the skyline are the church spires. Everyone has their place and they know where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. Civilization is reflecting the goodness of society. And on the bottom, we have the creeping industrialization that emerges in the early part of the 19th century. You have smokestacks and skyscrapers and insane asylums in the center. There is a prison. Obviously, the choice is very easy to make. You want to live in the beautiful medieval village. And Britain is the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, so populations are shifting as rural counties empty into these vast new urban centers. The landscape itself is transformed, as you can see in Pugin very clearly here. Starting in the 1840s, especially in York, railway lines connect once distant places. They crisscross the country, and smokestacks are replacing church spires. So against the backdrop of this is an incredibly turbulent economy, and there's a new emphasis on science and archaeology and emerging professional disciplines and more information for the average person than ever before. And it's the beginnings of a dramatic increase in the pace of life, and I think that's a legacy that we can all sort of connect with today. And all of this development starts to raise questions in people's minds about the implications of this way of life, questions that we're still trying to answer. For example, what to do with a building like the York Minster, a place that's been at the center of life in this city for almost 1,000 years. A new group of thinkers emerges to answer these questions, and the Gothic revival movement has been causing controversy ever since. So we have here, this is a view looking down the nave, which is the main part of the York Minster. Attendance at religious services, as you can see in this picture, has been in decline for a number of years during this period. There's lots of reasons for this: changing social structures, religious attitudes, emergence of new options for worship. But they're barely holding services. People aren't really attending, and the cathedral is mainly used as a public space. So it's one of the few large buildings that you can get into out of the rain to have a stroll in an area before shopping malls. On February 2nd in 1829, the citizens of York awoke to the sound of frantically ringing bells, shouting, and running footsteps through these narrow medieval streets, now obscured by smoke, and the minster was on fire. Now, even buildings made of stone are always at risk of fire, and almost all of the great medieval buildings have had their share of this kind of tragedy. However, even if they weren't attending services, the minster was already trading on its tourist capital and was very much loved, and within a few weeks they'd raised enough money getting subscriptions from pub workers and great figures alike to restore the minster after the fire, so they do manage to rebuild it. Unfortunately, a little less than 10 years later, the minster caught fire again. And after this fire, the public is understandably a little less generous, but they do manage to rebuild it. Now, this is Sidney Smirk, and not only is he devilishly handsome, he's the brother of the architect of the first restoration, and he has got a little bit of a bad rap as an architect. He's been called a first-class, second-rate architect, but what he was popular and safe. So there are bigger names who made fortunes designing fanciful Gothic Revival buildings, but with Smirk, what you're going to get is someone who made sure that the minster was put back together the way it was. And while they're at it, they decide to take a look and see what else needs work, including installing a fire sprinkler system and indoor heating. So this is when the man who gives the money enters the story, Dr. Stephen Beckwith. So his tomb you can see on the right here. He has a marble effigy tomb that's still in the York Minster. It did originally have arcades along the bottom, like the tomb on the left did. They've been since removed and are in storage now. On the left is Archbishop Harcourt, and now an archbishop is one of the two highest figures in the Church of England. So having Dr. Stephen Beckwith here, who is someone we actually really don't know that much about, buried in the same church, in the same kind of tomb, Archbishop Vernon Harcourt, is something pretty considerable. Now, on his death, Dr. Stephen Beckwith, who was a MD, a medical doctor in the city of York, leaves what today would be the equivalent of something like £3 million to charitable institutions. And he leaves a bequest to refurbish the chapter house. Now, the chapter house here is this round space up off the edge of the cathedral. And if you've never seen a schematic floor plan like this, the way this works is these are the exterior walls, and then all this crisscrossing things are the design of the vaulting that holds up the ribs of the roof. But the important thing to note is that the chapter house comes out there into the corner of the yard, 63 feet in diameter. It is one of the earliest and most complete timber vaulted ceilings. It was completed in the late 13th century. So this is the chapter house, and what a chapter house is the meeting place for the capital C chapter. It is just the governing body of the cathedral. It's a place for them to meet to conduct business. It's a grand space that even hosted a meeting of the English Parliament in 1297. And because it's at a cathedral, which is the official church or the home seat of the Archbishop of York, essentially it's one of the most powerful places in the north of England and is responsible for the well-being of millions. So this is the entrance to the chapter house, looking into it. And what's interesting is that the chapter house is not really one of the places identified after the fire as needing critical structural repairs. They note that it is in need of work, but the money that's given is to allow the chapter house to complete a restoration differently to what's done in the rest of the building, as we will see. The 1840s are an interesting time in the history of the Gothic Revival. Things are just starting to emerge as a coherent philosophy of restoration, and the restoration of the Minster in the 1840s, we can see trends emerging that are going to influence the most popular architectural style for the rest of the century. The first thing that they looked at was the stonework, and the arcades that are around the edge of the chapter house are individual seats for each of the chapter members. So each member of the chapter, which is the governing body, gets their seat, and they'll do things like hold ecclesiastical court in this building or vote on important cathedral business, and everyone has a seat. Around those seats are these incredible carvings. They're are lots of theories as to who and what they are, but nobody really knows. During the restoration, they don't do much with the carvings other than some replacement of pieces that had broken off and so forth. Inlaid tiles are one of the most popular medieval floor coverings. And we know that the chapter house at York probably had one because just about every other chapter house in an important medieval building had a tile floor, although it would have been a slightly different pattern to the one that you've just seen.
So this is the original pattern?
So this is the floor that was laid in the Victorian restoration. At the time when they went to do it, it was a stone of no, I think they said it was no special or historic importance. So at some point it had been replaced with stone, although because every other major cathedral or important medieval building had tiles, it's very likely that it would have had tiles at some point. Westminster and Salisbury both have similar chapter houses that do have tile floors surviving. It would have been a different pattern, but most of these tiles that are installed in the 19th century are based on actual medieval examples. So when we look at making tiles, it's actually quite a difficult process, and you can see how the craftsmanship that goes into cutting these tiles and designing them, it requires specialist knowledge that had been lost. And so several makers, including the man responsible for the design of the pattern here at York, a man named Herbert Minton, he began to experiment, and it takes him about 10 years for him to figure out how to reproduce the look and feel and process of medieval tiles, because they're quite thick slabs of clay. And the way that they get that design is that there's actually two different colors of clay. And whenever you have two different colors, it means they're slightly different chemical compositions, which means they dry and fire slightly differently. So getting them to stick together as a solid floor tile is actually quite difficult. And so he was a trendsetter. This is one of the first tile floors that is reinstalled since the medieval period. And it was generally very widely approved of in the Gothic revival. Other areas of the restoration were more controversial, but everybody loved the tiles. So Herbert Minton went out and actually traced the floor tiles. Most of them are actually based on the chapter house at Westminster. But there is one very specific tile that was created just for the York Minster. And you can see on the left here, there's a sheet of tiles, including this one that has this crossed key design. And those were original tiles from the medieval minster. And you can see here, it's been recreated in the center of the chapter house tiles. And as far as I can tell, that tile was never reused. That mold was only made specifically for the York Minster and never used again. From the floor now up to the glass. At the time that the glass was done, it was considered a necessary intervention, and you'll see why here in a second. And the man that they hired did a replacement of what was already there. Now, stained glass in the medieval period, and even today, primarily focuses on storytelling. So when you look at the images in a piece of glass, those images are telling you a story. And so it's very much a part of what the building is trying to tell you. So opinions for much of the 20th century were less than positive about the work that was done here in the 1840s. In fact, in the 1950s, they went so far as to pull out the restoration glass and banish it way up in the nave where you can't even see it, and replace it with medieval glass that wasn't the same story as what was in the chapter house, but at least of the right time period, which says something really interesting about changing attitudes towards conservation over the 20th century. So here we have a panel that was created. You can just barely see in the center this man's name, J. Barnett. He was, by all accounts, a cantankerous sort who was a glassmaker and cutter by trade, and he slaved away in his kitchen in dark, dank accommodations in York and reinvented this type of stained glass. Now, this is a copper red fleshing, and what that means is that after the glass has been liquid and cooled into a sheet, it's then exposed to metals for a second firing. So you get this really lustrous red color. And that was a technique that had been lost. So they don't hire prominent stained glass artists of the day, but this relatively obscure York glassmaker, because of this one important quality. And one of the key features of the Gothic revival is that they also have to revive all of the trades and crafts like tiles and stained glass that go along with these kinds of buildings. Apparently he didn't share the secret of how to make this kind of glass with his sons until he was on his deathbed. So in this image you can see a close-up of what the windows in the chapter house would have originally looked like. And the restoration notes say that they were filled with lots of holes. Previous repairs, they were in extreme decay that had obliterated the design with grievous mutilation and the consequent patchwork of generations of previous glaziers. And if you look at this is the state of the window today, you can see that's pretty much true. So a big contrast between that, where you can see what's happening, and this where it's lots and lots of little broken pieces. So everywhere you see one of those thick black lines is where the glass is broken and someone has mended it again with a new edging of lead. Barnett sets out to make copies of the panels on this window. On the left you can see there is one surviving medieval panel. All of the rest of them have disappeared. And on the right you can see Barnett's copy. So you can see what they were talking about when they said that this one in the left here was in fragments, in pieces, and the clarification that you get when you have a new stained glass window, and how much clearer that story is. So the intention with Barnett to copy those images rather than replacing it with medieval glass was that it was to preserve the overall iconography, the story that those windows were telling. And it's the most important feature to the Victorian restorers. And most of the reviews of this period praise Barnett's work for exactly that reason, that the general correctness and excellence of the workmanship. It's not an exact copy. If you line them up, the lead lines are not exactly the same, but he does trace the painting that's done to create the facial features on the heads. And they only managed to do the east window before they run out of money, unfortunately. But that does mean that the York Minster Chapter House has one of the largest expanses of medieval stained glass remaining in Europe. So while the rest of the building is repaired, the chapter does something very differently with the wall decoration. And if you look, you can just barely see around the corners of this window here. This is the back side of the doorway out of the chapter house. They decide not to replace the painting on the ceiling and walls. So they've replaced the glass, they've replaced the tiles, which with what they were pretty sure would have been there originally. So why not the painting? And the reason is that the chapter house originally, on the right, you can sort of see the engraving in the spandrels of the arches there, those pointy bits leading up to the center, were images of saints and bishops and figures that were associated with a religious past that was not necessarily one that they were comfortable associating themselves with anymore. The chapter house would have also been covered with very bright colors. So medieval churches were not the whitewashed places that we tend to associate with them. They were very brightly colored. And in many places in that stone carving you can still see traces of red ochre and vermilion and the black paint that was used. So Gothic art and architecture, it's fundamentally connected to a time when England was Catholic. And England had tried very hard to erase that past. And there were many people who were still very suspicious of introducing superstition and empery, as they called it. And part of the problem is Pugin, that man that we looked at who did contrasts earlier, showing the cathedral spires and the smokestacks, is very firmly Catholic and proud of it. And that made people nervous about what was appropriate for a Church of England church, which was Anglican and no longer connected with the church in Rome, about what was appropriate decoration for a building that represented the chapter. So this is the inside of the choir screen, which is out in the main part of the church, was repainted in the Gothic period later than our chapter house restoration, and then again in the 20th century. But this just gives you an example of what the kind of wall painting would have looked like. Very colorful, very decorative, and certainly not that kind of plain stone that you see there now. They actually did at one point try to paint one of the stalls with what they called party colors. And unfortunately, it doesn't really mean party colors, it just means multicolored. And received such bad reviews in the press that they went ahead and wiped it all back off. Now, all the critical attention was seeing what the Minster was up to, and everybody had an opinion about this restoration and how it should be carried out, so they were under a lot of pressure. So what they do, as a compromise, is they replace the ceiling panels instead of figures of saints and bishops, and this image is a little bit hard to see, I'm sorry, but around here you can see there are decorative panels and heraldry. So something that is medieval looking, but also safe. So this is a ceiling by Thomas Willimette, who's the Armani of his day. He's well known as a designer, as a stained glass, but this painted design cost them as much as the tiles and the glass combined. So that just shows how serious they were about showcasing their good taste, but also probably why they didn't continue to paint or use him for the stained glass. The chapter house is the physical representation of the power and presence of the earthly power of the men that run the cathedral. And so it's important for them in their decorative scheme to show that. The one thing they do keep is this inscription, which in Latin means, "As the rose is the flower of flowers, this is the house of houses." And they never actually meet in the chapter house. As much money as they spend on restoring it, they find the library more comfortable. It's heated in the winter. And this, as I mentioned, it's a big, expansive space. So they never actually go there. But the symbolic function of the chapter house is really what they're spending their money on here. So in the 1970s, that ceiling was actually repainted. They only replaced the designs in the center. There were sort of actually fairly authentic flower designs in the ribs, but they only replaced the designs in the center, and that's what you can see there today. And interesting that even up at that period, it wasn't really valued as an artwork, just as decoration. So they just covered over what Willimette did. They replaced it with the same design trace, but not at all valuing the original character of it. We're looking at the men involved. So why does this building look the way it does today? They had time being interested in all the latest scientific, artistic, and philosophical developments. And almost all the members, including Dr. Beckwith, which is probably how he came to donate the money to the chapter house, were members of this group called the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. And they are actually creators of one of the first purpose-built museums from their shared collections of archaeological ottomans, just a stone's throw down the street from the Minster. And they saw the chapter house restoration as their opportunity to put theory into practice. And probably a little later in the century, the answer to how they decorated the chapter house probably would have been a bit different, as it became more acceptable to have more medieval elements reflecting without the religious association. But what we call this restoration is archaeological, because it was based more on these new historical disciplines, new archaeological discoveries being invented. So very early Gothic revival is a romantic idealization of the feudal past, and later it has more codified religious and practical definitions. But in this particular period, in the 1840s, this building shows a transition between the romantic notions of medievalism and what it's going to mean in industrial future. So by 1847, so just a few years after the completion of the chapter house, the Ecclesiologist, which is a publication of early Gothic revival, notes 3 approaches to restoration architects could use: destructive, conservative, and eclectic. So these represent the diversity of attitudes towards restoration in this period and give us a useful sort of comparison for what happens here at York. And the first method is destructive, removes everything outside of your specific chosen style. So you want 13th century, everything else has to go. And this is very abstractly perfected and was advocated only by the most extreme architects. Conservative restoration keeps pretty much everything, even if it's later or includes things like heating ducts. And this is the least favorite method of restoration. The last is eclectic, and this is what we find in the chapter house, with the course of an individual project based on the whims, essentially, and the understandings of the restorer, who sometimes repairs, sometimes remodels, and gives them the freedom within those ecclesiological principles to alter historic designs as they saw fit. And they're very concerned with defining the boundaries of restoration, because the ornamentation of any part of a church, even a secular power center like the chapter house, carries moral consequences. So restoration has to have the responsibility of reconnecting architecture with the religious symbolism of the medieval church. For instance, the installation of a new heating system, however much it might improve the space, is not a restoration. To restore is to revive the original appearance. So this is a quote from the Ecclesiologist: "Lost by decay, accident, or ill-judged alteration." And because Gothic architecture is explicitly linked with Christian architecture, a good restoration is one in which theological understanding clearly manifested in the ornamentation. So one of the controversies surrounding Victorian restorations is that sometimes it's hard to tell. How obvious is the restoration to the public. Most people looking at those tiles wouldn't necessarily know that they were 19th century. Most people looking at the stonework wouldn't be able to pick out where Gibson White and Dove had restored some of the broken off noses. How much does that matter? What are our attitudes towards Victorian restoration and the use of the space today, as well as its original function? So if the survival is due to regular maintenance of a building, if you leave a medieval building, it ends up as a pile of stones. So what happens without that kind of regular intervention, even if we look differently on it today? Are the Victorians responsible for salvaging medieval structures? Perhaps so. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions.
On the tile, you know, it looked very intricate and very beautiful. Do they allow people to just walk through? How rugged is it?
Yes, it's very, and I actually have a piece that I can show you here in a minute of it, not of the York one, but of a Victorian era tile, and they're quite thick. They're at least an inch, sometimes closer to 2 or 3. So they're very durable. They're very hard, and there are a few places where there are chips and cracks, but surprisingly little. And Smirk was actually one of the first people to use concrete in architectural work in this period, and so these tiles are laid in a bed of concrete, which makes them unusually durable. So yeah, they don't put down any kind of protection because it's not valued as much as some of the medieval work, unfortunately.
Does the color go all the way through the tile?
It depends on the manufacturing process, and this is actually, I spent a lot of hours on my hands and knees in this building trying to figure that out. And as far as I can tell, most of them do. So you get one process called dust pressing, which is essentially where you take the powdered clay and mix it with a little bit of water and put it in an industrial mold that squeezes it as hard as it can so it turns into a hard tile, and then you fire it. Other ways are sort of pressing a wet tile and then dripping in that impression a more liquid clay and letting them dry. So it's hard to tell sometimes, and I can't exactly take these tiles out of the floor, so up in the air.
Do they actually do the tiles in York, or are they brought in from somewhere else?
So these tiles, Herbert Minton's studio was in Stoke-upon-Trent, which is a number of hours by train, sort of to the southwest. But these tiles came from a distributor in London, so it's unclear how much Herbert Minton actually was involved in the laying and distribution of these tiles, but they were most likely manufactured in Stoke-on-Trent. Yeah. Which is amazing because, you know, the amount of, when you look at the archival records, the amount of the speed at which these things were able to be transported and ordered and shipped as much as today. You know, you'd have a letter that the architect would send off in the afternoon, and then by the next morning they had a reply back. So the rail system and the mail system was absolutely incredible. It only cost them £25 or something to arrange shipment of all these tiles from London to York. So, and the total cost of the floor was about £215.
How many total tiles are there?
A lot. There's another woman who's worked that out, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's a lot. I mean, they're actually fairly good size. Most of them are 4-inch by 4-inch tiles, so if you can imagine